Paul Winters stared at the massive alien vessel hanging in Earth's orbit. As Earth's lead diplomat, he'd faced many challenges in his career, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "They're hailing us again, sir," said Linda Carter, his communications specialist. "Put them through," Paul replied, straightening his tie. The view screen flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of Ambassador Vrock, representative of the Kavalian Empire. The alien's gray-blue skin glistened under the lights of his ship, 4 yellow eyes blinking independently as he studied the humans. "Have you reached a decision, Ambassador Winters?" Vrock's voice rumbled through the translator. "Your species' delay only confirms our assessment of your inferiority." Paul maintained his diplomatic smile. First contact with the Kavalian Empire 3 weeks ago had quickly soured from exciting to concerning. The aliens possessed technology centuries beyond Earth's capabilities and made no effort to hide their disdain for humanity. "We are still considering your invitation, Ambassador Vrock," Paul said carefully. "The Grand Tournament is unfamiliar to us. We request additional information before committing." Vrock made a sound that the translator interpreted as laughter. "Information. Your species truly is primitive. The Grand Tournament is the ultimate test of a civilization's worth. For 12,000 cycles, it has determined the hierarchy of sentient beings in this sector of the galaxy." Behind Paul, General Karen Mills shifted uncomfortably. "They're warriors, through and through," she whispered. "Everything is combat and dominance with them." Vrock continued, "All spacefaring races participate. Those who refuse demonstrate cowardice and become protectorates of the Empire." The threat in his words was unmistakable. "We understand," Paul said. "Earth will send a representative." After the transmission ended, chaos erupted in the command center. "Are you insane?" General Mills exploded. "You just committed us to an alien gladiatorial competition." Paul sank into his chair. "What choice do we have? Their fleet could destroy our major cities in minutes. If we refuse, they'll label us cowards and take over anyway." Dr. Sam Wilson, Earth's foremost xenobiologist, spoke up. "The Kavalians evolved from apex predators. Their entire culture revolves around physical prowess and dominance displays. This tournament isn't just entertainment. It's how they establish their social hierarchy. And we're supposed to fight creatures 3 times our size with twice our strength?" asked Linda. Paul stared at the surveillance footage of the Kavalian ship. "We need someone exceptional." 2 days later, in a remote cabin in the Colorado mountains, John Mason split another log with his axe. At 42, his body remained powerful, honed by military service, and his isolated lifestyle. The sound of approaching vehicles made him frown. 3 black SUVs pulled up to his cabin. Paul Winters stepped out of the lead vehicle. "Mr. Mason," Paul called. "I'm with the State Department. We need to talk." John set down his axe. "Not interested. It's about the aliens." John paused. Like everyone else on Earth, he'd watched the news of first contact. "What about them?" "They've challenged humanity to prove its worth in combat," Paul explained. "We need our best fighter." "I left that life behind," John said. His military record was classified, but these people clearly knew his background. Paul handed him a tablet. "This is what we're up against." John studied the footage of Kavalian warriors training. Their strength and speed were frightening. "They're mocking us," Paul said. "They see humans as entertainment, not competition. They expect us to lose badly." Something hardened in John's eyes. Throughout his career, people had underestimated him, and he'd proven them wrong every time. "When do we start?" he asked. Paul's relief was palpable. "Immediately. The future of humanity might depend on this." As the officials briefed him, John watched more footage of the aliens. The Kavalians had no idea what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. Perhaps it was time they learned. John Mason stood in the center of a padded training room as scientists attached sensors to his body. 1 week had passed since he'd agreed to represent humanity, and the reality of his situation was sinking in. The Cavalian tournament dates back over 5,000 Earth years, explained Dr. Olivia Green, the project's lead researcher. Originally, it was how they settled tribal disputes. Now, it's how they rank every intelligent species they encounter. John stretched his arms. And they invited us as what? A joke. Essentially, said Dr. Green, adjusting a sensor on his chest. The official term they use translates roughly to entertainment bracket. They don't consider us serious competitors. General Mills entered the room with Paul Winters. We've received more details about the tournament structure, Mills said. Each species sends one champion. Single elimination. Matches continue until submission or incapacitation. Death, John asked bluntly. The room fell silent before Paul replied. It's happened, but it's not the goal. The Cavalians value skill over bloodshed, Dr. Green added. Still, accidents occur. John nodded. He'd seen combat. He understood the risks. Show me their champion again, he requested. A holographic display activated, showing a towering Cavalian with scurred blue-gray skin. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, the alien moved with surprising grace despite his massive frame. Drazkar, Mills said, undefeated for 12 years. He's killed 3 opponents who refused to yield. John studied the alien's movements, noting patterns and tendencies. His right side drops slightly after overhead strikes, he observed. Dr. Green looked impressed. Good eye. We've developed a training program based on everything we know about Cavalian physiology. Their muscle density is triple ours, but they tire more quickly in prolonged combat. For the next 3 hours, John trained against robotic sparring partners programmed to mimic Cavalian fighting styles. Despite his skills, he found himself thrown repeatedly to the mat. Later that evening, John sat alone in his quarters reviewing footage of past tournaments. The door slid open, and Paul entered with a file folder. I thought you might want to know why we chose you, Paul said, placing the folder on the table. John opened it to find his military record, including the classified missions. 38 high-risk extractions, Paul continued. 17 combat deployments. The situations where everyone else failed, they sent you. That was a lifetime ago, John said quietly. Your psych profile says you retired after losing your squad in Beirut. John closed the folder. We done here. Paul sat across from him. The committee considered 23 candidates, Olympic athletes, special forces operators, martial arts champions. You weren't even on the list initially. So what changed? I watched footage of your extraction in Sudan. Outnumbered, outgunned, but you adapted. That's what we need against the Cavalians, not just strength, but adaptability. John turned back to the screen showing Drazkar defeating a massive insectoid alien. They expect us to lose. Yes, Paul admitted. The Cavalians have already drafted a protection agreement for after the tournament. Basically, Earth becomes their client state. Something shifted in John's expression. Throughout his life, he'd faced opponents who underestimated him because of his average build and quiet demeanor. He'd used that misconception to his advantage every time. The next morning, John trained with renewed intensity. Scientists monitored his vitals as he pushed his body to its limits. The ship leaves in 2 weeks, Dr. Green told him. We're compressing 6 months of training into 14 days. John threw his sparring partner to the ground. Then we better make every minute count. That night, as he soaked his aching muscles, John watched messages from Earth. Millions were following his preparation. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He carried the hopes of an entire planet. Tomorrow would be harder, and the day after that. But John Mason had never backed down from a challenge, especially when everyone expected him to fail. The U.S. horizon emerged from its final jump with a shudder that ran through the entire ship. John Mason stood at the viewport, watching as Cavalier Prime came into view, a massive planet ringed by orbital stations and military vessels. Impressive, isn't it? Asked Dr. Green, joining him at the window. John nodded silently. After 2 weeks of intensive training and a 3-day journey, They had finally arrived. His body was as ready as it could be in such a short time. "We're being directed to the tournament docking ring," announced Captain Steve Rogers over the intercom. "All personnel prepare for arrival procedures." An hour later, John stepped off the ship alongside Paul, Dr. Green, and General Mills. A delegation of Cavalians waited for them. The aliens towered over the humans, their muscular frames making even the athletic John look small by comparison. "Welcome to Cavalor Prime," said the lead alien in surprisingly good English. "I am Zevnak, tournament coordinator. Your human will be processed and assigned quarters in the competitor wing." "Our champion has a name," Paul corrected firmly. "John Mason." Zevnak's 4 yellow eyes blinked dismissively. "Names are earned through victory, Ambassador. Until then, he is simply the human competitor." They were escorted through massive hallways filled with aliens of various species. Some resembled insects, others reptiles, or even crystalline structures that moved with surprising fluidity. All stopped to stare at the human. "They're surprised to see me," John observed quietly. "They're surprised we showed up at all," General Mills replied. "Most expected us to forfeit." The Colosseum was unlike anything John had ever seen, a structure that could hold millions of spectators, with a central arena that changed configuration for different match types. As they toured the facility, a commotion erupted nearby. A group of Cavalian warriors parted to reveal Drazkar himself. The champion was even more imposing in person, his scared skin bearing markings that signified his victories. "So this is Earth's offering," Drazkar said, circling John. "Such frail limbs, such soft skin." He reached out to prod John's shoulder. John didn't flinch. He maintained eye contact, saying nothing. "Does it speak?" Drazkar asked the other Cavalians, who rumbled with laughter. "When necessary," John replied calmly. Drazkar seemed surprised, then amused. "Save your energy, small one. You will need it to survive your first match. Though I doubt you will." After the Cavalian champion departed, they were shown to John's quarters. The room was designed for beings larger than humans, with furnishings that made John look like a child. "The tournament begins tomorrow with opening ceremonies," Paul explained. "Your first match is scheduled for the following day." Left alone, John explored the competitor wing. In a large communal area, other alien participants gathered. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with pity. "First human in the grand tournament," said a voice behind him. John turned to see a tall, reptilian being with iridescent scales. "I am Sandy. My world has competed for 12 cycles." "John Mason," he replied, extending his hand out of habit. Cindy looked at the gesture curiously before mimicking it. "The Cavalians expect you to provide. What is your Earth term?" "Comic relief." "So I've been told." Cindy lowered his voice. "Watch the preliminaries closely. Many champions reveal their weaknesses before the main matches." John appreciated the advice. "Why help me?" "Because every species that proves itself worthy reduces Cavalian influence," Xindi explained. "And because they have already mocked you enough." That evening, John observed the preliminary matches from a private viewing area. He studied the various fighting styles, noting how different physiologies created different strengths and vulnerabilities. "Nervous?" Dr. Green asked, bringing him a meal specially prepared with Earth nutrients. "No," John replied, watching a 6-armed warrior defeat its opponent with lightning-fast strikes. "Just getting to know the neighborhood." As the matches continued, John could feel the weight of Earth's future on his shoulders. But he had carried heavy burdens before. Tomorrow, the real challenge would begin. The Cavalian Grand Arena roared with the sounds of 80,000 spectators as John Mason entered for his first match. The opening ceremonies had finished yesterday, with Earth receiving the least enthusiastic introduction of all competing worlds. In the red quadrant, representing the unranked planet Earth, the human John Mason, announced the Cavalian host. The crowd responded with scattered laughter and mocking calls. John focused on his breathing, ignoring the jeers. He wore simple black fighting gear designed by Earth scientists to provide maximum flexibility. In the blue quadrant, representing the Proxima Alliance, 5-time regional champion, Grekthar. The crowd erupted as John's opponent entered. A 6-limbed warrior with gray skin and powerful elongated limbs. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, Grekthar acknowledged the crowd with 4 of his arms, while the other 2 held ceremonial weapons. "Remember your training," Dr. Green said through John's earpiece. Grekthar relies on overwhelming opponents with multiple strike points. John nodded, then removed the earpiece. From now on, he would rely on his own instincts. The match began with a thunderous gong. Grekthar immediately rushed forward, all 6 limbs moving in different patterns designed to confuse and overwhelm. John backpedaled, narrowly avoiding the first flurry of strikes. A glancing blow caught John's shoulder, spinning him around. The crowd cheered, expecting a quick victory for Grekthar. But John had studied multi-limbed fighters. As Grekthar pressed his advantage, John noticed the pattern. The alien's upper right arm always telegraphed his next move. John took another hit, this time to his ribs. The pain flared, but he used the momentum to create distance. "The human can only run," someone shouted from the crowd. John ignored them, watching Grekthar's movements carefully. When the alien attacked again, John was ready. He ducked under the predictable upper right strike and drove his fist into a nerve cluster near Grekthar's midsection, a vulnerability he'd spotted in yesterday's observations. The alien staggered, momentarily stunned. The crowd fell silent. John pressed his advantage, closing distance to nullify Grekthar's reach. He struck again at the same nerve cluster, then swept one of the alien's legs. Despite his opponent's greater size, John's technique sent Grekthar crashing to the arena floor. Before the alien could recover, John applied a submission hold targeting the nerve cluster. Grekthar struggled briefly before signaling surrender. The arena fell silent before erupting in confused commotion. "Victory to Earth's champion," the announcer declared, sounding surprised. In the Earth delegation's viewing box, Paul jumped to his feet. He did it. He actually did it. John exited the arena to find Dr. Green waiting with medical equipment. "That was impressive," she said, scanning his injuries. 2 cracked ribs, but nothing serious. "When's the next match?" John asked, wincing as she applied a healing compound. "Tomorrow. They've moved you up in the schedule." Her expression grew serious. The Kavalians are suddenly very interested in human fighting techniques. Back on Earth, footage of John's victory spread rapidly. News outlets played the match on repeat, analyzing his strategy and celebrating the unexpected win. John's second match came against a crystalline being that used sound waves as weapons. Despite the alien's unusual tactics, John identified a pattern in the sound attacks and used the arena's acoustics to disorient his opponent. Another victory for Earth. By his third match, John had become an unexpected sensation. Other competitors nodded respectfully when he entered the training areas. His opponent, a fluid-based entity that could reshape its form, presented unique challenges, but John's adaptability proved superior once again. In the Kavalian High Command Center, Drazkar watched recordings of John's matches. "This human uses our overconfidence against us," he observed. "Each opponent underestimates him." "Will you do the same?" asked Zevnak. Drazkar's eyes narrowed. "No. If he continues advancing, I will crush him properly, for the honor of the Kavalian Empire." As John prepared for his quarter-final match, he sensed the shift in attitude. He was no longer considered entertainment. He had become a threat. John Mason sat perfectly still as Dr. Green worked on his shoulder. 3 days had passed since his quarter-final victory, and his body was showing the strain of consecutive matches against increasingly difficult opponents. "The muscle tissue is healing well," Dr. Green said, examining the medical scanner. "But you'll still feel pain when you rotate your arm." John tested the movement, wincing slightly. "It'll hold." Paul Winters entered the medical bay with a data tablet. The semifinals begin in 4 hours. Your opponent has been announced, Vrector of the Orion Collective. Show me, John requested. The screen displayed a massive humanoid with mottled green skin and pronounced bone ridges. Unlike John's previous opponents, Vrector moved with precision that suggested advanced training. He's genetically engineered for combat, Paul explained. The Orion Collective has been breeding warriors for generations specifically for tournaments like this. John studied Vrector's previous match. He's patient, waits for opponents to make mistakes. Different from the Cavalians, Dr. Green observed. They typically favor overwhelming force, which is why he's reached the semifinals, John replied. He counters their aggression. As John prepared for the match, Cindy visited his quarters. The reptilian competitor had been eliminated in the previous round, but had remained to observe the tournament. The Cavalians are disturbed by your progress, Cindy said. No species without previous tournament experience has ever reached the semifinals. They're taking me seriously now. Yes, which makes you more vulnerable, Cindy warned. This tournament isn't merely sport. It establishes hierarchies that determine trade rights, territorial claims, and protection agreements. John paused. You're saying there's more at stake than pride. Much more. If humans perform too well, the Cavalians might see your species as a future threat rather than a curiosity. Cindy's scaled face tightened, and what John had learned was concern. Be careful. Victory can be as dangerous as defeat. When John entered the arena for his semifinal match, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Instead of mockery, the crowd watched with intense focus. The betting pools had shifted. While he wasn't favored to win, the odds had narrowed considerably. Vrector stood opposite John, studying him with cold calculation. When the signal came, neither competitor rushed forward. They circled each other, testing defenses with measured strikes. The genetically engineered warrior was unlike anything John had faced. Faster than humans, stronger than humans, with reflexes honed through selective breeding. The first exchange left John with a bleeding cut above his eye. The human bleeds easily, shouted someone from the crowd. John retreated, reassessing. Vrector pressed forward with perfect form, landing a powerful blow to John's injured shoulder. Pain exploded through John's body, nearly driving him to his knees. In the viewing box, General Mills gripped the railing. He can't match that strength. He doesn't need to, Hall replied quietly. Watch. John had shifted strategies. Instead of trying to avoid damage entirely, he was now absorbing glancing blows to study Vrector's movements. Each exchange revealed more about the warrior's fighting style. After taking another hit, John stumbled backward. Vrector, sensing victory, committed to a powerful finishing strike. Exactly what John had been waiting for. As the green warrior lunged forward, John sidestepped and used his opponent's momentum to throw him off balance. For the first time in the match, Vrector seemed surprised. That momentary hesitation was all John needed. He executed a complex grappling technique that exploited a limitation in Orion physiology. Their joints couldn't rotate in the same directions as human joints. Vrector struggled against the hold, his genetically perfect muscles useless against the unnatural angle. After 15 seconds of increasing pressure, he signaled submission. The arena erupted in shocked exclamations. John Mason, the human nobody had taken seriously, had just advanced to the finals of the grand tournament. As medical staff examined his injuries, John caught sight of Drazkar watching from the shadows. The Cavalian champion's expression was unreadable, but his intent was clear. The final match would be unlike anything John had faced so far. The grand arena had reached its maximum capacity for the final match. 100,000 spectators filled every seat, with billions more watching via broadcasts across the galaxy. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. In the preparation chamber, John Mason focused on his breathing as Dr. Green applied final medical treatments to his injuries. "We've done everything possible," she said, concern evident in her voice. but you're facing Drazkar at less than full strength." John nodded. His body was a patchwork of healing injuries. The dislocated shoulder from his quarter-final match, 3 cracked ribs from his first bout, and a deep muscle contusion from yesterday's semifinal. Paul Winters entered with General Mills. "Earth is watching, John. Whatever happens today, you've already accomplished the impossible." "I didn't come here to be a good loser," John replied simply. The call came for competitors to enter the arena. John walked through the tunnel alone, emerging into blinding lights and deafening noise. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Cheers mingled with jeers, respect battling with tradition. Across the arena, Drazkar made his entrance surrounded by Cavalian honor guards. The champion wore ceremonial armor that accentuated his massive frame. He carried traditional weapons, a short blade and a weighted striking staff. Though John knew these were mostly symbolic, the actual combat would be unarmed. The Cavalian Emperor himself watched from the royal box, his first appearance at the tournament. The stakes had clearly risen beyond sport. In the final match of the grand tournament, boomed the announcer, defending champion Drazkar of the Cavalian Empire faces the challenger, John Mason of Earth. The 2 competitors approached the center circle. Drazkar towered over John, nearly twice his weight and a foot taller. "You have surprised many, human," Drazkar said quietly, "but your journey ends here. I will try to leave you alive." John said nothing, maintaining eye contact. When the signal came, Drazkar attacked with frightening speed. His first strike caught John squarely in the chest, sending him flying backward. The crowd roared as John struggled to his feet. The Cavalian pressed his advantage, delivering punishing blows that John could only partially block. One strike connected with John's injured ribs, and he felt something snap. Pain flared through his torso. "The human is outmatched," called the commentator. Drazkar demonstrates why the Cavalian Empire remains supreme. In the Earth delegation box, Paul turned away. "He can't win this. We should signal surrender before he's seriously injured." "Wait," General Mills said, watching intently. "This is what he does." On the arena floor, John had adopted a purely defensive posture. Each exchange with Drazkar ended with John taking damage, but he remained standing, watching, analyzing. After 5 minutes of punishment, John was bleeding from multiple wounds. Drazkar paused, breathing heavily. "Submit, human," the champion demanded. "There is no dishonor in recognizing superiority." John wiped blood from his face. Not yet. Something changed in John's stance. He had been gathering information with each painful exchange. How Drazkar moved, where he placed his weight, how his breathing patterns changed when exerting maximum force. When Drazkar attacked again, John was ready. Instead of retreating, he stepped into the Cavalian strike zone. The crowd gasped as John absorbed a glancing blow to position himself perfectly. Then John struck, not with power, but with precision. His fist drove into a spot just below Drazkar's left chest plate, targeting a nerve cluster unique to Cavalian physiology. Drazkar staggered, his left arm temporarily paralyzed. Surprise registered on his face as John followed with a series of calculated strikes to the same area. The Cavalian recovered quickly, roaring in anger. He charged forward with renewed fury, but his movements had become predictable. John sidestepped the charge and delivered another precision strike to the vulnerable nerve cluster. This time, Drazkar dropped to one knee. The arena fell completely silent. With remarkable speed, John locked the Cavalian in a submission hold that exploited the nerve damage. Despite his superior strength, Drazkar could not break free without causing himself greater pain. After 30 seconds of struggle, Drazkar did something no one had seen in 12 years of dominance. He signaled submission. The silence in the arena was absolute. Then, gradually, a sound began to build. Applause, first from other competitors, then spreading throughout the crowd. John Mason, the human no one had taken seriously, had just defeated the greatest champion in the galaxy. The Kavalian Emperor rose slowly from his throne as silence gripped the arena. No one, not even the oldest spectators, had expected this outcome. A human, a representative of a species that had only recently achieved interstellar travel, had defeated their greatest champion. John Mason stood in the center of the arena, bloodied but upright. Across from him, Drazkar remained on one knee, his face a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. The winner of the grand tournament, the announcer finally proclaimed, voice slightly unsteady, John Mason of Earth. The traditional victory ceremony proceeded in a daze. John was presented with the champion's medallion, a symbolic token that carried immense political weight. As he accepted it, he looked directly at the Kavalian Emperor, whose expression remained unreadable. In the diplomatic chamber after the match, Paul Winters could barely contain his excitement as he entered negotiations with the Kavalian High Council. The protection agreement your government prepared is no longer relevant, Paul stated confidently. Earth has earned full recognition status according to your own traditions. The Kavalian negotiator bristled but could not argue. The human's victory was unexpected. But one tournament doesn't erase the vast differences between our civilizations. Perhaps not, Paul replied, but it does guarantee us the rights of an independent world rather than a protectorate. Meanwhile, Dr. Green treated John's injuries in the medical bay. 3 more broken ribs, torn shoulder ligaments, and a mild concussion, she reported. But you'll recover fully. John nodded tiredly. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him acutely aware of every injury. You've changed everything, John, she continued. The transmission delay to Earth is significant, but the first reports of your victory have reached home. They're celebrating in every major city. The door slid open, and to everyone's surprise, Drazkar entered. The Kavalian champion had changed out of his ceremonial armor and now wore simple training clothes. His normally intimidating presence seemed somehow diminished. I request a moment with the human champion, he said formally. When they were alone, Drazkar spoke with unexpected candor. In 12 years, no one has defeated me. I underestimated your species' capacity for adaptation. Most people do, John replied simply. The Kavalian Empire has existed for 15,000 years because we recognize strength when we encounter it. Drazkar extended his hand in a gesture he had clearly learned recently. Your victory honors both our worlds. John accepted the handshake, recognizing the significance of the moment. 3 days later, the U.S. Horizon prepared to return to Earth. The diplomatic outcomes had exceeded all expectations. Instead of becoming a Kavalian protectorate, Earth had secured a non-aggression treaty and limited technology exchange agreement. As John prepared to board, Cindy approached to say goodbye. You have accomplished something remarkable, John Mason. The ripples of your victory will spread throughout the galaxy. What will you do now? John asked. Return to my world with new hope, Cindy replied. If humans can rise so quickly, perhaps others can too. 6 weeks later, John stood at the window of his mountain cabin, looking up at the stars. Earth had changed in his absence. Nations that had been on the brink of conflict now worked together, united by the knowledge that they were part of something larger. A car approached, and John recognized Paul's government vehicle. Don't tell me there's another tournament, John said as Paul stepped out. Paul laughed. No, nothing like that. But there is a Kavalian delegation arriving next month. They've requested to meet you. Why? They're establishing a permanent embassy here, and they've opened their military academy to human students for the first time. Paul handed John a folder. They specifically want your input on selecting candidates. John flipped through the documents, pausing at images of young men and women in training. They're taking us seriously now. Very, Paul confirmed. The next grand tournament is in 3 years. The Kavalians expect us to participate again. John looked back at the stars, thinking of all the worlds and species out there. The universe was larger and more complex than humanity had imagined, filled with dangers but also opportunities. "We'll be ready," he said. On Cavalier Prime, in the Hall of Champions, a new statue had been erected alongside the great Cavalian warriors of the past. Though smaller than the others, the figure of John Mason stood with equal prominence, a reminder that strength came in many forms, and that underestimating an opponent was the first step toward defeat.